ask everyone here, could you put your hand up if you've seen that Time 2 ad already? That's good. That's good. Good start. We've got a great panel here today, but I just want to mention we've got 2 people on the panel that are responsible for that ad, part of the team that put that together, which is Lorraine Jennings and Fraser, and they're people who've given up their time, free time, of which we all know people in the advertising industry have none, to really make a change. So I just wanted to say thank you to them before we sort of started. So I've got a really good panel here today. I'm really excited that we've got some men on the panel as well, because solving sexual harassment is not going to happen if it's just women talking to other women. So next to me, I've got Dave Lowe. He's the Business Strategy Director at Digitas here. And then next to him, I've got the brilliant Groot. He's co-founder and head of insight at the Elephant Room. And then next to him, I've got the wonderful Lorraine Jennings, who's the Director of Services and Talent at NABS. And she's also author of the Time 2 Code. And then next to her, we're very lucky because she's flown in from LA, although she looks way too fresh-faced to have done that. And that's Nuseemuddeen, and she's the Managing Director and Chief Strategy Officer at Omelet LA. And then last, but by no means least, we've got the amazing Fraser, MBE. She is the Director of Credos, and she's also the co-founder of Time 2, and she is the person that did the amazing research which showed just how prevalent sexual harassment is today. And as Gina mentioned at the beginning, I mean, we are in the midst of a cultural volcano. I mean, it's been 12 months since the Me Too movement really started gaining traction. And it really lifted the lid on the brutality and widespread nature of sexual harassment in many industries, including our own. And for many men, it presented a reality of the world that perhaps they hadn't previously considered. And as this is a Bloom event, I want to be really honest here and start a very open conversation. This isn't a conversation that we're very comfortable having. I mean, we're also British as well, so we have the stiff upper lip. So, you know, silence often pervades, and I think silence can make people feel very uncomfortable. And culturally, I think we're very uncomfortable with women's anger. So again, in the interest of honesty, I mean, I've spent months talking to various women and people in the industry about sexual harassment. And, you know, and when I read the Time 2 survey saying so many women that are in the industry now, over a quarter have experienced sexual harassment in some way, I mean, that makes me incredibly angry. And it makes a lot of men I know incredibly angry as well. And I read something recently, the writer and activist Soraya Chemali, she said that the anger that we feel as women is an act of radical imagination. That anger's good, it's an engine for change, and men are part of that change too. So I really wanted to start by asking everyone on the panel just to share with us, you know, what's your take on this issue? I mean, where are you coming at it from? Can I kick off with you, Dave? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of introductions, I'm Dave Lowe. I'm from the strategy team upstairs. I've been here for 3 years, and before this, my kind of route wasn't that of a traditional planner. I came from an American management consultancy, which was a very different culture. And I've actually really enjoyed my time here, partly because of the ability to kind of be a bit more myself. And part of that is this word, banter. And I actually don't really like the word. I've looked up synonyms and there aren't any other good ones. But the problem with that word is I think it gives you a space to hide things behind, which are just frankly completely unacceptable. And so what I think we need to start doing is setting people a bit more direction in terms of what is okay and what isn't okay, hence the great thing about that video and also content such as the BBC's Grey Areas. So we can actually guide people, because we need to do that through our actions as leaders, but also I think people might need a few more formal nudges around how to change their behaviours. So from my perspective, we need to set that kind of line as to what is okay and what frankly isn't okay, and punish what isn't okay, but also be prepared to manage the mistakes that people will invariably make as they try and tread that line between this industry being a fun place to work and also it just being safe and protecting people in the way it should.
Thank
Hiya, my name is Will de Groot. Firstly, thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to even just sit on this stage with people who are doing amazing things. But yeah, so I'm the co-founder of a new creative agency called The Elephant Room, and really that was set up to kind of take the whole conversation around representation and diversity, and we kind of read a lot about it in trade press, but what does it mean in practice? What does it mean for agency structures? What does it mean for agency processes? What does it mean for teams? What does it mean for our inputs and outputs? So really just wanted to kind of put it into action and create a progressive workspace that involved and included a lot of young talent. So we work with young talent that sits traditionally outside of the creative industry, but I'm very aware that a lot of people don't want to work a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday anymore. The future of work is changing, and I think it's a huge part of this conversation as well in terms of the kinds of environments that we all want to work in and people feel like they can be themselves in. Another part of what I do is write as well. So I'm a writer. I do a lot of work and research in terms of the topic of men and masculinity, and I've been doing that for a few years. I've worked a lot with the charity Calm on the Calm zine, which a lot of you I'm sure will be familiar with. And I've also recently launched a platform called Mend, MEND, and really the aim of that platform is to kind of try and create a permissive space for men to engage in this topic. I think we've already mentioned this idea of silence, but I think the sort of gender debate and the conversation that's sort of really sort of kicking off in our culture is something that a lot of men assume isn't relevant to them when actually they're kind of very much at the heart of it. So how do you kind of bring about a conversation in a way that people feel is accessible and meaningfully kind of involves men in that journey is something that I'm sort of concerned with. The platform itself, we have a network of people kind of working across marketing and advertising, but also there's journalists, there's artists, there's academics, there's photographers, just trying to pull together a broad range of professionals to convene around the topic and just sort of build the thinking around it. Just on this topic, I think from my point of view, I think it's really important to remember that advertising and the advertising industry itself is directly responsible for prescribing so many of the stereotypes that kind of sort of cater to the objectification of women, but also men. So we work within the system. I think silence is one thing, but a complicit sort of aspect is another part of what we're talking about. So within that, I think all of us, kind of men and women, have a responsibility to think about the active role that we play, not only kind of in our workplace cultures, but in the output as well. It's directly linked to the output of the industry itself. So yeah, just that idea of kind of the responsibility that we all kind of individually play, I think is key in this.
Hi everyone, I'm Lorraine Jennings, Director of Services and Talent at NABS. I've been at NABS for 10 years. I've worked mostly on the advice line, helping people on a day-to-day, guiding people who are facing workplace challenges and giving guidance around that. I was also Bloom Vice President last year when we launched Bloom Fest, and that was when we had our first Booth of Truth. And in that, if some of you were there last year, was the first time that people have started to share openly and anonymously issues that they were facing in the workplace, and some of it was really candid. And it was also around the time of when Me Too was kicking off. So that was a bit of a platform, I think, for the conversation to start in the industry. After that, WACL held a gather where we started to talk about Me Too too, and I was on that panel, and that then started the Time To conversation, and we came together as a steering committee and started our work on that. So yeah, I'm author of the Code of Conduct. I'm proactive about trying to make change within the industry. I'm passionate about women and making sure that men are part of this conversation too, because they're also affected.
I think I have 2 mics, which is extremely exciting. I'm Nuseemuddeen. By my accent, you can probably tell I'm from the US. So I was one of the original signing sisters of Time's Up, which is kind of the equivalent to Time 2 here in the UK. It's really interesting kind of seeing, we're about 8 or 9 months in now, so we're slightly ahead when it comes to timing-wise. A lot of what Time's Up started with, for advertising specifically, was a reaction to Diet Madison Avenue, which was an anonymous Instagram account where a lot of the issues were surfaced. And I love that out here you've started from a foundation of insight and a foundation I don't know if this is actually working, but a foundation of insight and actually learning from your survey results and basing kind of the next steps and actions on that. For us, I think we were thrown into it a bit. And again, there's so many learnings from our side. One of the interesting things is, as part of Time's Up, we're all women who are holding positions of power within our organizations. So it's very much, I hate saying things like top down change, but it started with that feeling. What we're trying to do right now is really think about how we include everyone in the conversation. Again, out in the US, it was started by women only. And I think it's been a challenge for us to make sure that we're including everyone within the conversation. And I think that's what is really critically important for us to imparting change. And when we signed our code of conduct, a lot of it was us signing up for actions within our organizations. As we've learned, it's different based on if you are working at a big corporate agency versus an independent like ours. I'm lucky in that I could enact change the next day. If I wanted to put in new training programs, we did that. We literally found companies and organizations that we believed in, and we wanted to give a chance in doing things that were corporate trainings that didn't feel like corporate trainings. It didn't feel like you were watching a bunch of corporate videos telling you how to act or how not to act. It was really turned into a lot of something that looked a lot like group therapy, to be totally honest. It was about revealing yourself. It was about understanding who we are as people. And again, we talk a lot about bringing your whole self to work. This is for men or women. And being able to do that, it does come down to understanding who your whole self is first. So as an organization, that's stuff that we've been doing to try to, again, incite change in a slightly different way. But again, we're really lucky because we're independent and we can champion our own destinies. But yeah, there's lots of learnings kind of coming from what we've started. And I think this is the most exciting time we have to be in this industry because the rate of change is so much faster than it was a decade ago. And I think this is the moment for all of us to be able to stand up and really kind of find our voices within this conversation.
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm just want to start by saying how grateful I am to be here because this is such an important subject. And thank you to Bloom and thank you to Gina for inviting me. And Nikki, you've thanked all of us, but we have to thank you because you have done more than anyone I can think of to champion this issue and bring, the focus onto it as it so richly deserves. So if I can just explain who the hell I am. I'm from the Advertising Association. Not everybody knows us. We represent the entire industry in the UK. We're funded by the whole industry. Some of the people who are involved and sit around our board table are Scylla Snowball, James Murphy, Mark Evans from Direct Line, who is, as you know, voted Marketing Leader of the Year. And from what I've seen, he richly deserves that. People like Keith Weed and countless others. So they are leaders and some of my boss, certainly, and our bosses. And I'm in a very privileged position. I'm able to work with those people to notice the things that matter and affect change in our industry. So that's just setting us in context. In terms of being here at Bloom, I can't tell you how much of a difference the work and the solidarity that Bloom has affected has made to this whole initiative. I'd prefer if people don't tweet what I say today, but I want to share it because I think it's so important. From your Booth of Truth last year, someone who works closely with us saw one of the testimonies, and they brought that to the discussions when we were considering whether to get involved in Time 2 as an industry. And it was a very, very impactful thing. When some people were unsure, as Nikki said earlier, there was reticence and concern and some discomfort over whether we should get involved. That testimony made a very big difference. And then an ex-Bloom member, or maybe still, Hattie Matthews, she kicked off with a WACL event. And again, we had people there who were like, I'm not actually sure about this. But eventually they were persuaded that this is incredibly important and absolutely the right thing to do. Just one final reflection, because along with Lorraine, I was one of only 3 people to read all the 3,650 responses to the Time 2 survey. We expected 350. We were hoping, right, for 350. And I was thinking, shit, how am I going to do this alongside my day job? And then they started rolling in. And in the first 24, 48 hours, I felt like I'd had a physical blow to my body as I read some of the testimonies. The numbers are shocking, but they don't in any way reflect the seriousness and the impact of what I read. And I suspect that some people in the room may have contributed to that survey in some way. So all I want to say is that if you did, your stories will remain confidential forever, but they've made a difference, and every single one of them has been heard, and every single one of them will make a difference. And that's, something I'm delighted. Not delighted's the wrong word, but I feel a great sense of responsibility, and it's incredibly important to me to make that change happen.
Thank you. And building on what you've just mentioned, I mean, it's so brave, all the people articulating the experiences that they've had and the challenges that they've faced and the emotional cost of sexual harassment. I mean, when we were kind of looking at this panel, and even the word banter, you can't think of banter, and even you're talking about bringing your whole self to work. If you're Philip Green, you probably shouldn't do that, So I just really wanted to sort of get a view from everyone, because I'm aware of the conversations that are had publicly and the conversations that are had privately. And, for some agency CEOs, this boils down to, should we stop serving alcohol at our bars? Like, if we're going to be really brutally honest, that's kind of how they sort of condense this. So I really wanted to get a view from everyone as to what we can do to shift culture, because it's clear that we need to do that to ensure that, in 10 years' time, if you have a confession booth, everyone's going in going, I just confess that I face no barriers and no sexual harassment, because that's where we want to get to, probably faster than 10 years. 10 minutes, please. But how do we get there? Not a small ask, but how do we get there quicker? What do you think, Dave?
So culture is one of those really difficult things to change, I think, because you can't touch it or kind of see it. And if you actually think what it is, it's a culmination of loads of people's behaviours. So what you actually need to do is start changing the way people behave on a daily basis. And from my perspective, I think, again, and I alluded to it when I opened up, I think there's something about role modelling those behaviours, which we all have a responsibility to do. And I don't say we just in terms of this room. I also mean we as in, us guys who have a Y chromosome as well. So I think there's something there that, guys have to take more responsibility about this, because, it is that important. But also I think we need to actually give people those formal nudges in behaviour which help, and things like watching that content that we all now know exists and making sure everyone understands what's wrong in it and what's right in it. Well, nothing's right in it, but as in what's wrong in it, then I think it's really important. And I coach football to kids, and a big part of changing the way they behave on the pitch is about managing mistakes. And like I said, there is, not a tightrope, but there is still that need to have some kind of humour at work. But as I said at the start, if people do things which are entirely wrong, make sure they know it's entirely wrong, and you deal with it through the disciplinary route. But equally, people are going to make small mistakes, and I think we need to equip our managers with the skills to be able to have those conversations where they go up to someone and say, I know you were trying to have fun, but do you think about the way that might have made that person feel? And get them to reflect on that. And I think just making sure that managers have those skills would be a really valuable thing to start changing.
Because I'd love to get a NABS view on that, because one of the kind of depressing things about the Time 2 survey was the amount of women that haven't come forward, that aren't reporting anything, which really shows a huge lack of faith in the employers that they're working for. I mean, what would be your advice? Because obviously there is, for women who are suffering from sexual harassment. Statistically, it's likely that there are women in this audience that are. That this is the NABS advice line is a first point of call. But what kind of broader, regardless of kind of what level you sit in a business, what can you do?
Yes, I think that's a really good point. So our survey told us that actually people who are harassed aren't reporting it within their organisations. They're not calling NABS. We don't have that. We don't see that trend through our call rates either. Well, who they're telling is actually their colleague or a friend. And I think part of that's because they see those individuals as an ally. I think that's a really important word. I think you, as a colleague, as a manager, as someone in a leadership team, can be an ally to your teams to try and make sure that you have got this open door, welcoming kind of stance, that people will come and talk to you and can trust that what they're going to share with you is going to be acted on and safely and responded. I think there's a bit of people from the survey, having a lack of trust in HR, and that certainly came through. And I think building on your point earlier, we all have a collective responsibility. This isn't on those that have been harassed to do something about this. Of course, the example like the Booth of Truth and the verbatims, that has propelled this, and it's because of that honesty and open conversation that's made and helped us drive this forward. But now we've all got a responsibility. So every person in this room, every manager, every leader has a responsibility to be an ally. And yes, making sure that they call out behaviour, unacceptable kind of boardroom banter, because sexual harassment is broad. It's that everyday kind of banter right through to the more serious sexual assault. And also what the survey told us, and what was really clear, was that there's a lack of understanding of what is sexual harassment. So I think point one for everyone is to understand and educate your staff on what is sexual harassment. And that's what the Code of Conduct and so on tries to do. So I think that is our first step.
And what's your view from the US? Is there anything that we can... Because I know in some ways there's parts of this journey that the US is ahead of us. I mean, is there anything that you would take that you think actually this would really... Because anecdotally people say to me, particularly when they're international and they come to the UK, oh my God, your culture is, you would be getting sued left, right and centre in the US. Like this wouldn't happen, which is like good and bad in some ways. But what could we steal from you guys?
It's interesting because I think when I think about kind of the way that you are raised within kind of U.S. culture, we are a litigating culture. So right now there is a moment where everyone is afraid of what they're saying, and again that there's good and there's bad with it. I think that the good part is everyone is being held accountable, which was not something that happened before. Again, being in the industry for a while, I've seen the gamut of behaviors. I have seen a dramatic shift in the last 12 months in terms of what you see even in an email. Everyone is hyper aware of things, because the reality is you can be fired over an email now. It is that sense of like explosiveness within our advertising community right now in the US, which I think is really interesting. I think we are learning what the boundaries are. To our point, I think the issue is a lot of this happens in the gray area. And being able to better define what the gray area is really challenging. And I think that's where behavior modification needs to happen on every level, from executives to people who are just coming into the industry. But we are having a really, it's been a really difficult, particularly the last 12 months, in figuring out exactly how far we prosecute. But I think that, again, when it comes to like what we can learn from you here is the involvement of men from the get-go in this conversation, even just kind of in our chat backstage before we got on today. I'm really excited and invigorated by that, because I think you're starting from the right place, because when it is just women having this conversation with each other, yes, it's empowering. Yes, we share our stories. Yes, it feels like you have another voice in the conversation. But the reality is it's not going to just take half of us to make change happen. So we need to be able to figure out how we can all work together on this.
And it's not just women being sexually harassed either. So of the people that responded, said 9% of guys. Yeah. And I read stories from men who were gay, who were being sexually harassed by their female boss. and they were facing untold stress because they weren't out at work. They were a man who was being sexually harassed, and if they told anyone, they feared they'd be laughed at, and it was their boss. Problem, huge. Three different types of issue in one, and in some ways that affected me even more than the stories that were like my own. I was the first respondent to the study, and I sat and I counted up the times that I've been sexually harassed in my career. Now, it's been a long career to date, so I've had plenty of years in which it could happen, but I got over 15, really easy. And I thought, my God, I'm going to be right at the extreme end of the spectrum. No. When the results came in, I suddenly realised I was by no means alone. There were tons of women and some men like me. Horror struck. I had to call NABS, right? I was so affected. I was like, please help me. I can't handle this on my own. And NABS team was amazing. But then I realised that we, all of us who've been affected, we're not alone. And that gave me a great strength. And it also gave me hope that things can change. But it's not just women, it's guys too.
I think that's such a powerful point in terms of the collective strength of men and women when they come together. And Will, I'd love to get your view on this, because I've certainly had some awkward conversations with men. I mean, some, where you categorise in, okay, you're a dick, and to be honest about it. And others where you think, actually, you're just so scared of saying the wrong thing that you're just not engaging at all. It's far easier for you to just talk about your agency bar for hours. That is your biggest business headache in the world of transformation, is whether or not to serve booze in your agency bar. So how do we get men to that self-censorship? And I know women self-censor as well, and that's why stuff like the truth booth is so powerful. But how do we free men, but particularly if they've got the double bind of also being sexually harassed and not necessarily having the language to kind of communicate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important question that we all need to be kind of asking ourselves. Even when I was kind of looking at the website in the lead up to this event, and I know that it was open to men and women, and I think it's just so telling that the room is filled with women. And we can have these conversations, and they're amazing, and they're really insightful, but I'm always so conscious that there's just this entire half of society that is not hearing these conversations. And so that really, I think, is kind of crucial. How do we create those permissive spaces? One thing that I think about quite a lot is the language that we use around this. And talking to a lot of young guys, colleagues, friends, a lot of what we hear and a lot of what we receive, a lot of the messages and the codes are around toxic masculinity, mansplaining. And I think you'd be forgiven for thinking that actually your starting point is one that's really rooted in kind of negativity. There's very kind of little in the way of positive things to kind of grapple onto. And a lot of the guys that I talk to are really confused about where to begin. How do they kind of engage in a topic that for them, it already feels like they're sort of one foot kind of backwards. And that's just a really hard place to start from, I think. So yeah, creating those inclusive spaces. I don't know. I think it's a really hard one, but I think a lot of the thinking that I do is around language and how we actually create a language for guys to kind of navigate the conversation. One thing that I'd add as well is that I think there's a real difference. A lot of this is about the generational difference. So I think a lot of older white men who work in agencies, there's a real difference in the way that I think men who represent a very particular type of person versus a lot of younger guys that I talk to, they have a very different understanding and command of the issues and the nuances at hand. And I think that's something that to be celebrated. That younger generation that sort of inherited a set of behaviours and attitudes that actually doesn't work for them. They don't want it, but it's the question of what's the alternative. And I think in shaping that, that's something that, again, collectively, that requires men to listen to women and spend some time kind of listening to each other to formulate that language.
I just want to add to that, what was quite interesting in our findings as well, that men were more likely to speak up when harassment is happening to someone else. but they wouldn't speak up when it was happening to them. And I thought that was quite an interesting kind of observation about men and behaviour, and that paralysis that can come over men equally as well as does with women. But if you're witnessing it, men are more likely to speak up, which I think is fantastic.
I've seen men in my team deal, because the whole conversation has changed over the last year, hasn't it? And we've been working closely on this, so everyone's aware of it, our place. And I work with some amazing men, and we always have a laugh, and I get involved as well. But they will call it out now. They'll say, mate, I'm not sure you could say that. Or they'll say, rather, used to be if you were approaching the line, people would shout, HR, but now they'll shout, time to. Yeah. And it's a kind of fun way of calling it out without, let me just reassure the AA is not in a hotbed of sexual harassment. But we do have fun, and that's part of the joy of working in this business, isn't it? So yeah, just that almost like yellow card, time to is a way of reminding everybody that this is a different era.
Oh, I think one other thing, just kind of in the whole world of kind of creating a set of language, is allowing men to also be the opposite of toxic masculinity and find some sense of vulnerability within what they have to say as well. Because I think the other side of it is we haven't created a safe space for men to be able to be vulnerable as well. So what we've done is, again, just through trainings and different programs that we've got, is allowing everyone to come to a place and speak open and honestly. And maybe this is a slightly more American thing that we do. And again, it does turn into a bit of group therapy, but it's incredible to see how people have changed within even our little agency, interacting with each other once they understand the other side of the story, and they understand that everybody comes with their own narratives. Whether your background is being a person of color, being a part of the LGBTQ community, like there is so much that everyone comes to the table with, and some of it we don't see. But being able to actually have like open conversations about it in the workplace is another way to kind of counter some of this banter, is actually being able to allowing people to have real conversations versus needing to hide behind, again, some toxic conversations that you may already be having.
And I think a word that Will mentioned first, which I think is a really important one, is nuance. So this is a massively complicated thing, right? I mean, you've got people of different levels, different genders, one where there's kind of fewer variables, but then just all the different personalities at play. Like you can make a joke to one person and it be okay, but you could make that same joke to another person, which for a whole variety of reasons, whether it be their personality, how much you've known them, the levels you're at, it's not okay. And so I think it's trying to, as we were saying earlier, kind of give people that guidance, but just be aware that they will make mistakes, frankly.
Yeah, I just thought on that point it might be useful for me just to read out the sexual harassment definition, because that's really key. Yeah. So it says, the relevant legislation defines sexual harassment as unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which has the purpose or effect of violating the dignity of a worker or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for them. But the crucial word in that definition is unwanted. So, and I think that's to your point, what might be acceptable banter, let's say, for me, might be completely different for Will. And I think you have to really, that's a tricky kind of place to navigate, really, in the workplace, if, you just have that kind of observation that everyone's going to think the same as you.
So I've actually got a kind of personal story on that I don't mind sharing at all, in that I once went into a workshop and there were loads of people in there who were all females. And they took the mick out of me about looking like Paul Hollywood, as though that was desirable. Anyway, the point is, for a lot of people, that would have been like pretty bad. I mean, you're running a workshop with, many people of the opposite sex who are older than you, but they were lucky and they did make a mistake. But for me, I kind of didn't mind it. So I think it's that whole kind of that judgment which is important.
I think you touched on it as well, the generational shift. I find this really interesting in terms of what has been effectively internalised by a lot of women that have been in the industry for some time is, I was on a panel recently and a woman said, I'm lucky I've never been sexually harassed. That you shouldn't be lucky not to be, that should just be a given. But I've said things like that myself, because actually when I started out in the industry, what was acceptable then, I mean, is not acceptable now. And I think it's really challenging from a business perspective, because I think a lot of the time when we have these conversations, and the scale is putting a kiss on an email to criminal acts of sexual violence against women in workplaces. So it's such a long chain. And I suppose my question for the panel is, I'm always really aware of this when we talk about, how the next generation won't tolerate this, they don't tolerate it. I love it when men speak up in meetings, when somebody's talking over you or being offensive and it's a young man, it's literally, oh, that's like, you're my spirit animal. But how do we sort of ensure that we don't just get a bit complacent, that we don't go, we've started this, the next generation is amazing, because actually it's our responsibility to change it now for them. So how do we what's your view on how we have momentum and how we don't get waylaid by the complexity of the scale and, the side issues of the problem, as it were? It's not a small question, so I'm going to direct it to Lorraine first. Sorry.
So what's my view? So my view is that I think, we're starting off as an industry on this. So Me Too propelled, I think, lots of industries forward by, many years, which is fantastic. And we now can much talk about this than we could, 12 months ago. That in itself is success. I think as an industry, it's time too, we're starting off. We've created this campaign. We've created this code of conduct. We're saying to organisations, sign up, let's start, let's get moving. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to learn some new things. It's an ongoing process. And I think that as a industry, if we're open to that, we're open to making mistakes, we're open to, not getting it always right, and that there will be fuck ups, but we have to make sure that we're doing it for the people. Gina mentioned right at the beginning in her opening speech, it's about the talent, and it's about making sure that we are being inclusive and keeping all our wonderful talent in this industry. And I think if we don't, that's a business loss. There's a cost there. So, from Time 2's perspective, we're planning to run the survey again next year. This isn't just here this is, here's our campaign, see you later. This is an ongoing project for us as a team. So we're not giving up. And companies have signed up to this. We've had over 160 companies sign up, including groups, so WPP, Publicis, and also big media owners like ITV, The Guardian. So everyone's committing in some way to this. So if they don't carry on, then I think the industry will hold them accountable.
I was just going to add to that. I think it's about education, and I think it's about finding opportunities to continuously educate people on issues and topics that they might not necessarily have the greatest amount of awareness on, partly because it doesn't relate to who they are as an individual. Just thinking about the Me Too movement and it being started by an African-American woman, Tarana Burt, and how that narrative and that conversation, there's a lot of debate about how it's being co-opted. And I just think those kinds of discussions are really important to have, because we're talking about the origins of these discussions. We're talking about people's identities, the way that they navigate those spaces. And that's crucial. There are so many people that I think it's easy to assume that we're all part of this sort of conversation, we're all on board. But, within agency culture, I think, just going back to that point, it's a really interesting one, because I just think one thing I always have in mind is create a culture, not a cult. And I think quite often agencies run like cults. We talk about banter. I hate banter. I don't want to be around banter. You know what I mean? It's just sort of there's real ways of kind of at this sort of juncture in culture. I think there is a sense of urgency around this question, and it's the tip of the iceberg. And it's almost like we're living through it, and I'm kind of waiting to see how the dust settles a little bit. But this is the tip of the iceberg, and I think through education, through things like this, within our agencies, kind of having that, time in the week where people, whether it's like a sharing, fireside type, whatever it is, but people being able to share perspective. I think it's really interesting to hear about culture in the US, because if anything, I feel like the places that I've worked have been very resistant to empathy, like the idea of sharing experience and this real resistance to the idea that there is no place for empathy in business. Like, my role is in research and people insight. Like, without empathy, I can't do my job. But but there's a real resistance to it, right? Yeah.
And it's interesting because the core of our agency is empathy. And it's even more interesting that my CEO is an older white male who is very, very adamant of making sure that is felt within the entire organization. And that is something that, again, I think how does this movement keep moving? The reality is, like, this is not a binary conversation. This is not men and women. There is so many, intersectionality is one of the key elements of understanding this. And really understanding and celebrating difference within your organizations is what becomes so important. And I think that's where we're getting really excited about where the change can start to happen, and allowing these kind of big open conversations to happen is really transformative to an organization. I would so highly recommend being able to actually talk about like your own background and your own experiences, and within mixed groups. We found it, like, again, groups of like 30 people, being able to talk about where you came from, what your experiences were like, changes your everyday conversations. And I think that was a really easy and actionable thing that we did, that has, again, changed the way Banter works. And Banter happens in America. It does. It's slightly different because, again, everyone's slightly afraid of being sued. But there's still as long as you know that people are coming to the table with good intention, you're able to better navigate those gray areas. And I think, again, understanding what your backgrounds are is where your true understanding can really happen.
Were you asking Nikki about how do we keep things going?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree with everything the rest of the panel have said. How to put this? I think we need to encourage the men who have championed this, and public celebration of the people who've got behind Time 2. So we could start by Bloom congratulating Stephen Woodford, who's the CEO of the Advertising Association. He didn't have to do this, but he chose to. So I think, using our collective power through communications, which is our business, and tweet and publicly say thank you and congratulations, and we're here if you need further, support.
Thank you. I just wanted to pass it over to the audience, just because we're a bit tight for time. If anyone's got a question, there's one over there. If you want your questions not to be tweeted or you want anything private, just say that. I mean, this is a very respectful space. So, yeah.
My question is, a few times when I've spoken with, God, I hope this doesn't sound horrible, people older than me, and especially women older than me, you get that you get the response of, oh, God, that's not sexual harassment. Oh, in my day, when I first came in. So I get that the younger generation is really good and, they're happy to take that stance. But how do we work about changing the mindset of older, and in my case, I found it more with women, older women, to actually get them to recognise that what they went through isn't what the next generations should have to go through to sort of prove themselves?
That's such a good question. Who would like to take that?
I find that such an unsisterly, mindset. But I've witnessed it myself in the last 12 months, and it exists, but it's decreasing in influence. And I can think of examples where people have put that view forward. They lost the argument pretty publicly.
I will say the other thing is organizations like Time 2 and Time's Up a big purpose around that is helping educate a lot of these women and being able to, again, be better equipped for the conversations today. Because, again, I empathize with it because experiences are different. But I think what's happening now is there's a level setting happening with what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And again, those leaders who aren't on board with that are a part of a generation that is kind of that will be left in the dust.
That's a really good question. I think that I was told I had a challenge around the same area, and I've always brought up to see the best in people. So I will explain it to them in simple terms, as if they need to learn. It doesn't always work, but it was a good piece of advice. Has anybody else got a question? There's one just there.
I was just going to follow on really from what was just said. And I think the really key thing, being an older person, sorry, I'm going to highlight my age, but there you go, is just don't doubt yourself. That's a really key thing. Very quickly, I had a really odd situation last week. And as I say, I'm not a youngster. And I did exactly what Lorraine said. I went back to a hotel room and I rang my best friend and said, am I being oversensitive? Was this odd? And she was like, get the hell out of there, just go. And I couldn't believe at my age, I was doubting myself and I had to go through that process of going, am I being a bit, strange? Is this right or wrong? So I think if anything, just don't doubt yourself. If you feel awkward, it's wrong.
That's such good advice. Has anybody else got a question? There's one just there. Oh.
Thank you. My main question is that obviously with a lot of these amazing conversations that happen, and today we've come away with some great actions that we can all put into practice, like as a manager, how we can tackle behaviour. But when it comes to not only the older generation but other senior people that aren't kind of aware of these issues, how do we go about reaching them? Because obviously here we're all aware and we're it's almost like preaching to the converted. How do we get those decision makers that are maybe ignorant to this to actually pay attention and make it a priority in their business?
I think that's a really good question. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of what we've done with Time 2. So we knew when we set up Time 2 that, yes, we can talk to individuals like yourself, but as you say, it's preaching to the converted. So we knew that we needed to go in at our leadership level in order for change to happen. And actually, for that to trickle down, there's lots of different pinch points in the industry where culture change can happen, can cascade up, can cascade sideways, but down also is really effective. So we have asked companies to publicly endorse the Time 2, sign up to the code of conduct. So companies, like I mentioned earlier, are publicly now saying, we endorse Time 2, we've signed up to it, we're going to work through this code of conduct, and then we've given guidance to organisations on what they need to do, which includes things like training, educating, make sure that everyone's aware of what they need to do if sexual harassment is occurring within their organisation. So they have got 6 to 12 months to work through this, and we've said you need to work through this, and then we're going to come back and we're going to resurvey and we're going to see where the industry is. I think the industry is quite affected by what other organisations are doing too. So a WPP signs up, other organisations are going to sign up, and that's what's happening, which is really positive. So, I think it's happening, but I think we need to see where we are in 6 to 12 months to see whether that has really had some change, and we're hopeful that it will. It will.
Yeah, I also think there's a message there around kind of talent, which is a word we've used a lot. So if leadership, as we're talking about an audience, let's kind of hit them where it hurts, which is results, and make a really clear link between the fact that if 50% of your talent, or even more, I mean, there's guys too, aren't feeling comfortable as a result of behaviours from other people in your organisation, then it's going to have an impact on your results. So it's like we all know, kind of managing performance is critical. And if people aren't going to perform at their best, if they're not feeling kind of safe and happy. So I think that's a message that we should kind of push.
One other small thing for, again, to be able to actually action things within companies is the executive reading club, which is something that we have, where we encourage people at the executive level to share articles, to share things that are important to them, and then have a discussion. So again, at the executive level, we have conversations every 2 weeks about articles that are interesting, whether it has to do directly to the Time's Up movement or other things within kind of culture and politics in particular in the US. And again, it's all about having a balanced conversation. Not everybody is coming from the same perspective, and really being able to understand the other side is critically important to being able to have a conversation where you can actually change people's opinions. Because if you don't understand where they're coming from, you'll never be able to change their opinions. So for us, that's been a really simple tactical thing to do. It's been really helpful.
I know we're pushed for time, so I'll be really quick. Data always helps with difficult decisions. If they say it's not a problem, tell them 83% don't report it. So maybe you're not aware.
Thank you so much to the panel and to everyone here as well. I'm sure there's people in this room that have maybe written something on a confessions board at some stage that's really made a change. So thank you for having such an honest conversation. Thank you, and thank you for the questions.